Healthcare is too expensive. Employers are offsetting costs onto their employees. Who will make health benefits affordable for hardworking Americans and their families? You will. This is the Empowering Plans Podcast, a show dedicated to helping you once again emphasize the benefit in benefit plan. Now prepare to learn, plan, save, and protect with the FIA Group.
Hello, everybody. Welcome to another edition, a special edition of FIA's Empowering Plans podcast. I am your host for today, Brady Bizarro, the Director of Legal Compliance and Regulatory Affairs here at the FIA Group.
What do they call that?
It's called LaCara, I believe,
LaCara.
actually. Yeah. And with me, not as always, but a special guest today, because we have a special edition podcast to record, is the one and the only Jen McCormick, our Senior Vice President of Consulting. Say hello, Jen.
Hello. I'm so happy to be here with you today, Brady.
Right? I think we're doing a good job so far.
I hope so.
Repeating, what Ron would do if he were here. But look, we have something very special and important to talk about today. It's on everyone's minds. It is the coronavirus, right? You can't get away from it. It's on the news all the time. We just did a webinar where it was pretty prominently featured, and we promised everyone on that webinar that we would record a podcast to go a little bit more in depth about what you should do as an employer, how you should prepare, what response might look like. We're still early in the phases here. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but I remember from the webinar we talked about how 114,000 global cases, 700 or so in the US. We know that there's not a lot of testing available right now, but we expect that when the test rolls out more, the number of positive cases will skyrocket. That happened in Italy. We expect that'll happen here in the US. And so it's very likely that for you listeners, either someone on your employee plan or someone you know, maybe someone in your workforce, might come down with this virus, or certainly the impact will be felt at your place of business because someone might know someone else who's been in contact. There's a lot of fear and panic sort of running rampant out there. And so what we want to do today is try and calm some of that down by just going over what are the things you can do as an employer to prepare, what concerns should you have. And I think the most important place to start, Jen, right, is probably the employee benefit plan, right? How does it interact here, or what's relevant in the document to protect employers, or what should they be thinking about when dealing with this coronavirus?
Yeah, this is an important reminder that there are two separate hats that an employer wears. One as the employer responsible for their employees, and one as the sponsor of their health benefit plan where they are taking on a fiduciary role. So first, we can talk about the health plan because I think it's important to start there, because when we're talking about a medical condition, that's where most of the employees and their dependents and family are ideally going to receive care based on what the benefit plan design says. So one of the categories of essential health benefits is lab services. So we know for the categories of essential health benefits like lab services, you're not allowed to have any sort of annual dollar limitations in place. That's great news, right? So a plan's going to be prohibited from that. However, that doesn't mean that a plan is going to have to cover this with no cost sharing. So most plans probably cover the labs or the diagnostics testing by $20 copay or maybe a smaller coinsurance. That should not in any way prohibit or discourage people from going to the doctor to get this testing done. The main concern, in addition to the availability of tests, which we can talk about in a little bit, is how this would impact a plan who wants to proactively take measures to encourage those employees and their families to get tested if they have come in contact with someone who has this disease, COVID-19. And what we're learning right now is that if you are a high deductible health plan, what do? Can you waive the deductible?
I don't know. You tell us.
Yeah, so right now, this is something that there is no answer to, and the answer is no. As of today, there has been no guidance from the IRS that would allow an employer to waive the deductible for a high deductible health plan. The IRS rules, although they were recently expanded to allow for certain chronic conditions to be covered without the deductible or by waiving the deductible, that has not been the case for COVID-19 at this point. So you still should make sure that you are including those copays, coinsurance, deductible, what have you, for a high deductible health plan, but that doesn't mean you couldn't waive it if you are not subject to those regulations.
And just to add real quick here, we brought this up on the webinar too. There's a lot of moving pieces happening in the government. Every day they're having their own press briefing about this issue, and they've rolled out some plans to alleviate some of the burdens on employers and employees. So I fully expect that by the end of this week, there'll be some guidance from the IRS on this. I can't see why they wouldn't allow you to waive the copay in this instance. Obviously, there's a lot at stake here. Just like we talked about how there may be some plan for, a payroll tax or other relief for employers and workers. So I expect that we'll see more of that. But one thing that's important to know too, Jen, you touched on this, about how this test is considered an essential health benefit. A number of governors around the country have come out with statements saying that under their emergency powers, they're requiring fully insured plans in their states to cover this test and to cover it at no cost sharing. And weirdly, the government's relying on the Affordable Care Act, which it's also fighting in court, to force companies to cover this test. So kind of ironic, but everything's pointing to, again, a common sense approach here. We want people to get tested if they suspect they might be at risk. It's much better than the alternative, right? And that's kind of the takeaway. A few other things quickly on the plan document here that are important. And we've reviewed our own plan document just to make sure that we're where we want to be and the things you want to look for. Your actively at work definition, make sure that you have language in that provision there that covers the eventuality of employees working from home, right? Are they still considered actively at work? That's important to make sure you don't have any gaps with your stop loss, for example. Look at your continuation of coverage provisions. Do you have a discretionary leave that you can offer an employee who may be out of PTO or sick days, who may not qualify for FMLA or other state-based leave? You want to make sure you have the ability to continue their health coverage if that's your prerogative and not have any coverage gaps or stop loss. So check your language in that regard as well. And finally, on this exclusion issue, I'll let you talk about that one, Jen, because I think it's a pretty novel idea. We think it might come up, right, in the future, depending on how this virus spreads.
Yeah, this is definitely a concern. And this is not only a concern from the plan document perspective, but also from the stop loss policy perspective. So there are a number of exclusions. We've seen this in the past in these unfortunate circumstances that are otherwise unforeseeable. Just a quick example is with the Boston Marathon. And there were claims that were coming in for victims. And the concern was whether or not they could use the active war exclusion to exclude those claims of the victims who had loss of limb. And it was a good question and never something we had contemplated when it comes to the active war exclusion. And I think this same scenario is going to arise when it comes to our hazardous activity exclusions or our foreign travel exclusions or maybe a blanket exclusion in the stop loss policy. It's time to really analyze those exclusions and see what they're intended to be used for. Because if you have a reference to travel to a foreign country or a country that has a alert or state that has declared a state of emergency, is there any language in your plan that's going to exclude those claims? Because that's certainly not the intent here.
Right. And I think, like you said about stop loss, we'll see how liberal the carriers are with their own wording, but this could pose problems going forward. Another document that's very important, as we know, to consult here to make sure that you look through and revise if necessary is the employee handbook, right? Similar to some things we just discussed with leave of absence, continuation of coverage provisions, but also make sure you have either in your handbook or some other official policy. Have you looked at your work from home policy? Is it sufficiently robust? Is it updated to allow for your workforce to have to work from home if you think it's necessary to do that? Do you have a disaster recovery plan in place? Do you need one? How about a business continuity plan? Do you have provisions, contingency plans for these kinds of events? Because these exact events, right, we're not always expecting them to happen. So, but if you don't have a plan in place, when they do happen, you could be caught flat-footed. So it's very important now to take this seriously because this is going to be a situation that's with us for the foreseeable future, for months probably, maybe even into next year. So really, even if you feel like you dropped the ball and don't have a plan, it's not too late, right? Start drafting them. If you have questions, reach out to us, ask us what we've done. Again, being in this industry, there's not that many sources out there that speak for our industry that are giving guidance on this. There are plenty of sources out there talking to the fully insured world or to corporate America, but for self-funded plans and TPAs and other entities in our industry, we're really on the front lines of this. We're taking this very seriously, and we reviewed our own policies and put together a list of best practices that we think will protect plans going forward. One thing I want to mention too is check your insurance policies, right? Make sure you have the coverage that you need. Maybe a little too late, to get them now, but know what you have in terms of coverage with workers' compensation, employers' liability. Do you have travel insurance? There's something you can buy called business interruption insurance. Again, we don't know how serious this outbreak will get, but you want to make sure that you're prepared in the event that it does get serious.
The thing here, too, is this is not a matter of if. This is a matter of when. So being prepared is going to be something that everyone must do so they can address this with their employees, with their benefit plan, because this is a situation where the when is going to lead to medical costs. So to prepare for the medical costs, you need to make sure that you have a plan design that addresses how the benefits are going to be covered, a situation where you have a leave of absence policy that would be available for someone if they needed to take a particular leave to care for themselves or a parent or for a child or for some other relative. And there are certain caveats and nuances for the FMLA rules as well, what happens in the case of a pandemic and when you could take a leave. So now is the time to actually address this proactively. And when we talk about making modifications to our plan or our employee handbook, it's always important that we communicate. This is a scary time for employers and for plans and for employees, individuals. So communication is going to be key. Maybe outside of all of these recommendations that we're talking about, this is a good time to have that communication with your staff, with your employees. What should they expect? What do they know? What questions do they have? Maybe make a resource, whether it's human resources or some nurse or someone that would be available to answer some of these questions to calm people's fears.
Right. One of the things we discussed internally was the importance of having a single point person to handle questions, right? To make sure the communication from your company and from the employer is unified and singular. So you don't have different messages coming from different places. That's how you really can stoke panic and confusion, and you don't want to do that. One other thing I think we should mention before we sign off here is this pandemic or borderline pandemic, I think eventually will implicate more federal laws that we are familiar with already in our industry. So the ADA, you mentioned FMLA, people are asking us questions about HIPAA and does it apply? The answer is yes, HIPAA still does apply, generally speaking, but there are more nuances about how you should handle requests for information. HIPAA itself has language written into the statute that discusses what to do in the event of, quarantine or a pandemic situation, but it's not true that HIPAA is suspended. A lot of misinformation is out there about that. We've had questions about can employers send employees home if they appear sick? The answer is yes. Be wary of discrimination issues, but a lot of this comes down to common sense. We talked about how, this is a scary situation to be dealing with, and there are a lot of things to deal with all at one time. But at the end of the day, we're going to recommend using common sense. That's what we're doing, right? A lot of people in our industry are planning travel to various conferences. As Jen mentioned, there are many states who have declared states of emergency, and there are some hot zone areas. Use your common sense about whether you want to attend those events or send your employees there, and how to handle situations in your own office as they come up. But again, the foundation here is making sure that your policies, your documents are updated, have been reviewed, because if you don't have that done, really, then you're not going to be able to implement any kind of policy that makes sense going forward. And if the situation gets worse, or when it gets worse, rather, you're going to be in worse shape. So if you do have particular questions or concerns, as they come up, reach out to us, pgcreferral@fiagroup.com, and we'll be happy to answer the questions that we can.
Right, yeah, and last thing to kind of note here too is communicate, and when you're making these changes, don't do it without communicating. The last thing that you want to do is set yourself up for a gap with your stop-loss policy that says that you are allowing someone who didn't otherwise have paid time off to get paid to not be at work or at the office because they have the coronavirus, and there's nothing that would allow them to continue coverage under the plan.
Great, and as more updates come out, as we expect they will through the government, and as they apply to the self-funded industry, we'll be sure to mention them, to put out industry blasts as necessary. And as always, feel free to reach out to us, and we'll be happy to share our own best practices and sort of guidelines for how we recommend tackling this issue. All right. I think we got through a lot of information there. Hopefully this is a first in what
Hopefully
could be...
everyone's still with us, not scared.
Right. Hopefully they're not scared, right? But I think we'll be having a few more of these podcasts if I had to predict, and I'm in the prediction business, as we know, Jen. But for now, on behalf of Pat, the man Santos, our great producer, who does appear a little ill there, but I'm not sure he...
Are you
sniffles.
allowed to ask him that? Yeah.
I can't really ask him, but he looks to be okay. On behalf of Pat, myself, and the Jen McCormick, thanks for tuning in. Thanks for empowering your plans.